Thank you for coming in. So I would like to introduce Dr. Booker, Michael Booker. He holds a PhD in modern European history with an emphasis on modern Britain and Ireland from the University of Tennessee. His doctoral dissertation, The Civil Religion of Loyalism in the Southwestern Lowlands of Scotland, from 1688 to the present. He will also introduce the idea that together the Loyalist institution, including the Orange Order, Rangers Football Club, and the Loyalist Street Gangs and Paramilitary Association, and Protestant Loyalist flute bands, together constitute a civil religion based on a tenet of Protestant loyalism. Dr. Booker's area of specialty include modern European history, modern Britain history, and modern British history, nationalism, football culture, and American West. Dr. Booker recently completed the book titled Images of America, endorsed for Arcadia Publishing. Let's welcome Dr. Booker.
Well, it is nice to be talking about my area of expertise and something that I'm very passionate about. You know, in a lot of our classes, a lot of you take my classes, and we don't have the luxury of going into detail about something as precise, as minute as the Loyalist culture in Northern Ireland and the southwestern lowlands of Scotland. Before I get started, I want to unravel what this idea of loyalism is. And simply put, in Northern Ireland is the Protestant nation of the island of Ireland. The population in Northern Ireland in the 6 counties is majority Protestant. The minority population is mostly Irish Roman Catholic, right? So in Loyalist culture, the Loyalists are those in Ireland, those in Scotland that are loyal to the monarchy, that want to see at least the northern part of Ireland remain part of the United Kingdom. And so the people that we're going to be talking about, they're not your everyday ordinary Irish. They're not your St. Patrick's Day celebrating Irish, or your Catholic Irish that we usually associate with the Irish. So the phenomenon that we're going to be looking at today is the ritual of parading and marching on certain holidays in the Loyalist calendar. Now, unraveling something like the history of Northern Ireland, the history of Ireland, is very complex. It's almost like trying to understand the history of the Balkans. I mean, it has its roots, at least what we call the sectarian history, that is between the Irish Catholics and the Protestants, goes all the way back to the 1500s and the period of Elizabeth I. I'm not going to talk about all that. What our discussion is going to be more about is the modern period and the role that flute bands and marching play in both Northern Ireland and the lowlands of Scotland. When I say the lowlands of Scotland, I'm mainly talking about the area around Glasgow, Scotland, so down toward the bottom of what is now Scotland. So during the course of the 20th century, Loyalist bands emerged as one of the primary vehicles of the cultural transmission of popular loyalism in Northern Ireland and the industrial lowlands of Scotland. These Loyalist bands, and I'm going to show you what they sound like. I'm going to show you what they look like at the beginning to give you an idea of what we are talking about. These bands are musical groups whose primary function was to march in formation with the Loyalist Orange Order, a Protestant Christian brotherhood that was originally established as an agrarian group to fight Roman Catholic rebels in Ireland. They're called the Orange Order because they have reverence to the English king, the British king, William III, who vanquished James II. The Protestants of Northern Ireland, those that have fealty to William III, III, they believe that James II was a Roman Catholic tyrant. When William III, William of Orange, was invited to come and depose James II, he was seen as bringing civil and religious liberties, not just to Ireland, but to the United Kingdom in general. So before I go any further, right, I'm curious as to what these people sound like. Remember, to us, it's going to sound just like a band. But the songs that they are playing, they are loaded with symbolism. If you're a Roman Catholic, they're very derogatory, what we would call triumphalist songs oftentimes. Remember, the title of this lecture is Claiming Sonic Space. And that's what these Protestants do. They do it in their hundreds of thousands, especially at the beginning of July, on the 12th of July, to celebrate William's victory over James II. When? 1690. There are thousands of parades throughout the year in Northern Ireland and Scotland. So let's see what they sound like. Snare drums, bass drums, and these boxwood B-flat flutes. These 6-holed little flutes that make a very shrill, penetrating noise. So let's just take a second and see what this sounds like. With the orange, do you see these old men with the orange collarettes on? They are the members of the Orange Order. This is their march. They are being escorted by these what are called blood and thunder flute bands. You see, it's loud. If you're walking by a cathedral, it can penetrate into the depths of the cathedral. If you're walking by a Catholic neighborhood, they're going to hear it. You can't escape it. They are claiming sonic space. There are a variety of flute bands, but most of them are composed, as we see here, of fife or flute, drums, some kind of drum ensemble. They have been the ones that have historically been the most prevalent at these Loyalist events. Loyalist bands were major actors in the annual Orange Order ritual dramas. These are ritual dramas. They are reenacting, they are reliving the glories of their Loyalist Protestant past against their enemy. And who is their enemy? The Roman Catholic foe, the Roman Catholic Irish, that are directly connected to, they believe, the papacy in Rome. As part of the overall civil religion of loyalism, these flute bands, they act much like a typical church. Maybe like a church choir, in that they were designed to use the medium of music regularly to affirm the group's foundation stories. When they are playing these songs, you might not know the words, but everybody in Belfast, those Protestants, those Catholics, they know the words. They are reaffirming the group's foundation stories, their moral values to the community of believers. These band performances not only guided the marchers and provided entertainment for the spectators, but they deliberately retold the violent history and the cultural mythology of loyalism through songs like The Sash My Father Wore. See these orange collarettes? They're sashes. Derry's Walls, the YCV Brigade, the Billy Boys. Loyalist music was a distinct cultural marker that reinforced Loyalist identity when played in the context of ritual commemorations that celebrated past blood sacrifices to the Loyalist cause. These bandsmen, they used their instruments as sonic weapons. They're sonic weapons in their annual quest to claim space. They want to let the Irish Catholic population know that they are there and that they are in charge. And this is a symbolic way of claiming space. Loyalist bands represented what I would call the essence of pugnacious Protestantism. We also see on display a Loyalist folk collage, the symbols of loyalism, much like you would see if you went into a Catholic cathedral or any other church, the symbols of a religion. This constitutes, at least the bands, along with some other vestiges of loyalism, constitute part of a secular, civil religion. Aggressive, quasi-military, orange processions supported by these loyalist bands, belting out a shrill, gut-wrenching cacophony of triumphalist songs have flourished as a mainstay since the earliest Orange Order parade in 1796. The European tradition of marching in step to the rhythm of flutes and drums is rooted in the Dutch House of Orange. In the 1590s, Maurice of Orange introduced the Greek and Roman practice of incessantly marching and drilling to improve obedience and to improve discipline amongst the ranks of Protestant Dutch soldiers. The marching and drilling techniques that were introduced by the Dutch stadtholder Maurice of Orange during the later stages of the 80 Years' War, just in case you want to know, that's 1568 to 1648. It resulted in a very distinct esprit de corps that's superseded previous identities. I mean, this is what we see in the military today. You go into the military with one identity, and you perhaps come out with a much different identity. When properly implemented, this created an exclusive community of soldiers whereby comradeship prevailed in good and bad times, and where old-fashioned principles of command and subordination gave meaning and direction to life. Central to this new marching and drilling technique was the use of fife and drum music. Just in case you don't know, a fife is a type of flute. This fife and drum music rhythmically guided the movements of marching soldiers, both in training and on the battlefield. And we can see this in a lot of our paintings of the American Revolution, can't we? Fifes, drums. This is distinctly, as it's used in this period, a European, that is Dutch and Protestant phenomenon. Central to this new training technique, like I say, this drum and fife music. The Maurice de Saxe, the Marshal of France, later explained that movement to music is natural, isn't it? I mean, if I turned on some music right now, some of y'all kind of wanted to start marching to that other stuff. But if I turned on some NWA right now, I think some people would start bobbing their head. I know I would. If I turned on some Iron Maiden right now, I think that we could maybe get into it. I know I turn on music at home and my wife she automatically just starts moving, you know? Music does that, doesn't it? It has that effect. Nature and instinct did it for them. They didn't have to think about moving. The cadence of the drum guided their movement. The Dutch military use of repetitious marching and drilling techniques in its training, especially in training its infantry, soon translated into victories on the battlefield. Discipline. And that caught the eye of a lot of other European countries who started to adopt this technique of using drums, fifes, to guide their soldiers, to instill discipline, to instill uniform marching. By the end of the 18th century, most European militaries had adopted this musical tradition of marching and drilling with the fife and drum. Public parading with fife and drum accompaniment on commemorative holidays in places like Northern Ireland, especially Northern Ireland, but also in Scotland, were already well-established practices by the time William III actually took the throne in 1688 in England. It was already a practice when he stepped ashore at Carrickfergus in County Antrim in 1690 in Ireland. It was a decidedly Protestant practice. It was imported to Ireland by the English army. Since at least 1557, the English military had used fife and drum melodies to call orders, to accompany marches. Ongoing interaction, obviously, with their fellow Protestants, right, the Dutch, during the 80 Years' War, eventually led to the adoption of many of Maurice of Orange's revolutionary marching and drilling techniques by the British by the 17th century. Militarily inspired marching and parading to fife and drum gradually found favor among both official and popular imitators in Ireland over the course of the 18th century. Public commemorations that marked Protestant victories over the ongoing Catholic threat. If you're English at this time, if you're Protestant at this time, the big bad wolf that's trying to get you, the grave enemy of the time, is Roman Catholicism, wherever it manifests itself. So what kind of holidays before William are they commemorating? Guy Fawkes, right? Have you ever heard of Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder? He was a Roman Catholic that tried to blow up Parliament, but he was unsuccessful. Also, they celebrated the anniversary of the Irish Rebellion of 1641, when basically Irish Catholics turned against the Protestant population and massacred scores of Protestants throughout Ireland. So celebrating both victory and victimhood is what there was already a tradition of in Ireland, at least. After the victory of William and the Williamite army at the Battle of Aughrim in 1691, military-style marching became a much more widespread and popular activity amongst Protestants in Ireland and even in Scotland. Each year on November 14th, Dublin Castle and the Dublin Corporation annually sponsored elaborate public celebrations to remember William, to remember the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. These state-sponsored royal commemorations in Dublin usually included columns of soldiers marching in step to drums and fife music. The Boyne Society, a smaller organization, they mimicked the pageantry of the official celebrations by using their own marchers accompanied by fife and drum. By the end of the 18th century, marking significant dates that were related to the symbol of William III, of William of Orange, was an established popular tradition in Ireland. Founded in 1795, the Orange Order, this fraternal Christian brotherhood, was able to capitalize on the popularity of the already established Williamite commemorations by incorporating traditional aspects of these parading customs into their own public ritual displays. The Orange Order's practice of marching on significant Williamite dates fit neatly into an already existing popular culture of public display that routinely marked significant historical, military, and religious and civic events by staging public festivals and parades. Early Orangemen, these people right here with the collarettes, right? Early Orangemen borrowed heavily from the more ephemeral tradition of the agrarian, working class bands who had similarly marched in a military manner. Appointed officers, they identified themselves with their orange cockades, their floral displays. Like the established military bands, amateur agrarian bands usually consisted of a collection of a handful of fifes, several fifes, side snare drums, and a couple of bass drums. They usually took to the streets on significant religious and state and local occasions. The Orange Order's adoption of the fife and drum as their preferred mode of musical accompaniment was a quite natural one, either through the influence of soldiers, and there were a lot of soldiers that were members of the Orange Order, or simply by just imitating the army. You can see by the bands here, you know, for us, the outfits aren't all that militant. But for the person in Northern Ireland, especially the Catholic, the regalia that they use does take on a militant flavor. The Orange Order parades differed from the earlier parading traditions in that they were pageants of the Protestant working class. They were focused on symbolically claiming space, both physical and ideological. space through their ritual demonstrations of strength. This, what they're doing here, marching through the streets, is a demonstration of strength. The shrill, penetrating fife, flute, drum music traditionally employed by the Orange Order was an important factor in the effectiveness of the civil religious ritual because it enabled the Brotherhood's message to be transmitted to a much wider audience using popular songs like The Sash My Father Wore, or Croppies Lie Down, or The Walls of Derry, No Surrender. They were loaded with meaning, these songs. Even if they're not singing them, sometimes they actually do sing while they're playing, but even if they're not singing them, as I said earlier, Loyalist marchers know what these songs mean. Roman Catholics know what these songs mean. Orange music produced by Loyalist bands penetrated the physical barriers that were placed between Irish Catholics and Protestant marchers. Loyalist music played during the public Orange Order marches overwhelmed the entire space that was being ritually claimed by the Orangemen. These annual Orange Order ritual commemorations served as a catalyst for both the formation of a vibrant Loyalist band culture and a rich variety of typically Irish music. The most Irish music that you can possibly, and I know this is going to sound crazy to a lot of you. The most Irish of Irish music is this. The Irish jig stuff that you've heard, what we call the fiddly-dee music, right? And that's a modern creation for the most part, that mostly is gleaned from the English tradition and the Scottish tradition. It's a creation of republicanism, of Irish nationalism in the latter part of the 19th and going into the 20th century. Fife and drum music has been a central feature of Loyalist ritual since the first Orange Order parade in 1796. Local volunteer militia, military units usually supplied the music for the Orange Order at first. One eyewitness at the first Portadown Battle of the Boyne Parade in 1796 observed the presence of what he called a long drum, a larger bass-type drum, and a group of 3 fifers who supported each Orangeman. Now, the other type of popular drum, we really see it gain popularity through the 19th century, is something that is so unique to Ireland. You don't find this exact type of drum anywhere else but Ireland. It's called the lambeg drum. The lambeg drum. They are enormous. They start off being somewhat smaller. By the time we get to the 20th century, most lambeg drums weigh around 120 pounds. They're extremely loud. Lambeg drums, accompanied by fifes, they become the norm as we move into the latter part of the 19th century. Lambeg drums, they're these enormous double-sided drums. Let me show you exactly what they look like. I'm even going to play some for you in just a second. They're these giant double-sided drums. You can see how big they are versus the people and these are usually larger people that are wielding them. They're usually decorated with a portrait of William. You can see that guy on the horse right there. That is William crossing the Boyne on his horse. They're usually decorated with Orange Order motifs, Loyalist motifs. The lambeg drum could stake perhaps the claim to the loudest piece of percussion, not amped up obviously, the loudest piece of percussion in the world. It's frequently played above 120 decibels. To give you an idea of what that sounds like, so those of you in aviation, if you've ever been around a small plane taking off, that's about 120 decibels. So a mnemonic drill, that's around 120 decibels or so. The lambeg drum was used as a sonic weapon by parading Orangemen through the first half and really throughout the 19th century. So let's see what this sounds like. All right. bunch of noise, doesn't it? That's the point. That's the point. That's the point. That's exactly what they want to create. They want to create noise. This is to make sure that the Catholics, once again, understand, make sure that these Protestants are heard. And it's interesting, you know, the Catholics don't have any type of ownership, really, of this society. This society of Northern Ireland, of Ireland during the 19th century, is controlled by the British. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I love the land-bag drums. They're something else, aren't they? I mean, it's unlike anything I've ever seen or heard. When you hear them in person, you can only take so much of it because it's just so extremely loud. After the 1850s, land-bag drumming gradually fell out of fashion because the instruments, they're big, they're cumbersome, right? An Orange Order march could be 15, 20 miles on any given day. So that you have to carry that drum and beat it, right? And replace those very expensive heads of the drums, skins rather, of the drums that are made out of goat skin. So they're very expensive, they're very cumbersome, and you have to play them slow. So if any of y'all are percussionists, y'all know that you can make a machine gun rattle on a snare drum a lot faster than you can do something on this. Even on a normal-sized marching band bass drum, you can play that a little bit faster. And it's not as cumbersome to march with. The only places you really see these land-bag drums anymore, they've outlawed them in Scotland because they're just too obnoxious, they're too loud. And you really don't see them in the capital city of Northern Ireland, Belfast. Where you mainly see them is in some of the small rural agricultural market towns that are scattered around the various counties of Northern Ireland. So ultimately, the land-bag drum will be replaced. Accordingly, fifes. These aren't actually fifes, and you can see how the land-bag drum really overwhelms these flutes, right? Ultimately, the fifes, they're not really loud enough. They're not shrill enough. So as we move through the 19th century, really it seems by around the 1880s, louder, multiple-keyed, blackwood, B-flat melody flutes. Blackwood, B-flat melody flutes would replace the pipes as the instrument of choice of these loyalist musicians around the 1880s. Fifes, as I say, they were phased out because they're hard to play. If any of y'all play an instrument like this with a fife, you have to put a lot of air through it. And if you're marching 12, 15, 20 miles, you know, after a while, it's hard to put that air. Now, with these new B-flat flutes, you barely have to blow to get that shrill sound coming out. And they're really easy to learn. So one of these B-flat melody flutes, it's akin, and y'all have heard them already in the footage. They are akin to, say, a modern piccolo, if you're familiar with your band instruments. So from at least the 1880s forward, most loyalist bands in the lowlands of Scotland and Northern Ireland consisted of a combination of B-flat melody flutes, snare drums, right, cymbals, and usually marching band bass drums. Until the 1970s, most orange bands in Scotland were semi-autonomous entities associated with or sponsored by the Orange Order, by some district or local lodge. And on the whole, most band members during this period were also members of the Orange Order. Individual Orange Order lodges, they would also hire bands to march with them during their commemorative parades. That's usually what happens today. Money made from participating in these events was usually used to purchase sheet music, purchase instruments, purchase uniforms. In Scotland specifically, as we move into the 20th century, there were usually two types of these bands. One was a little bit more respectable. The more respectable bands were focused on musicianship. Band discipline was strictly controlled by a band conductor, a band sergeant, maybe a corporal. There was kind of a military style of organization. There was more discipline. But as we get to the end of the 1800s, the sectarian, that is the interfaith conflict between Protestants and Catholics, start to heat up. Not just the sectarian, not just the religious conflict, but also political conflict between these two groups starts to heat up. These more disciplined bands weren't that popular. There was another style of band that starts to gain a lot more popularity, and these are called the Billy bands. Billy, William, right? William III. These Billy band, membership in these Billy bands were usually lower working class folks, people that go to Rangers football games, right? Soccer matches and stuff like that. Membership in these Billy bands consisted of lower working class orangemen. Most of these lower working class orangemen were more concerned with making noise than they were playing music. They wanted to annoy or provoke their Irish Catholic neighbors. Really, provoke them. Bring them out into the street so you can have a dust-up. The flute corps was usually led by up to 10 side snare drums, up to 2 bass drums, with the band's name usually printed on the drum skins. Even in the case of the rougher Billy bands, band culture was encompassed within a broader ambit of Orangism until at least the 1970s, when a network of autonomous Loyalist bands was developed. So as the sectarian conflict starts to develop at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, and basically a war develops between the Protestant and Catholic communities in Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles. The war was known as the Trouble. It was the longest running war in modern Europe in the 20th century. As this conflict in Northern Ireland escalated, Loyalist band culture experienced a radical change. Independently run, stridently loyal, more British than the British, and notably militant, blood and thunder bands started to emerge. See, there's an evolution in the bands. They start off with, kind of that Revolutionary War, military, drums and fifes. Then they graduate to lambeg drums, and they graduate to snare drums and marching band drums and cymbals and these B-flat melody flutes. And now they're taking that next leap to, and this is the most popular style of drumming today, or of bands today, and that's the blood, sounds heavy metal, doesn't it? The blood and thunder bands. Blood and thunder bands first emerged as an emotional reaction by young male loyalists to the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and their terrorism campaign against the Protestant British population of Northern Ireland. It was an emotional reaction. Membership in a Blood and Thunder band, it provided Loyalists with an outlet that let them actively and publicly demonstrate their solidarity with those paramilitaries, with those Protestant fighters on the front lines. Those Protestants in Belfast who were under siege by the IRA and their Catholic neighbors. Although Blood and Thunder bands operated independently from the Orange Order, they still played a major role in the Orange ritual parades. Blood and Thunder bands were also able to convey a much more militant and aggressive vision of loyalism while supporting an Orange Lodge on parade. The secular and oftentimes borderline paramilitary imagery that was connected with Loyalist band uniforms, their symbols, their flags, their songs, set them apart from the intensely religious and conservative Orange Order. The Blood and Thunder bands were able to influence the emotional atmosphere of a Loyalist parade by the types of songs they played, how they played them, and where along the parade route they chose to play them. How they played them perhaps in front of as they passed through or by a Catholic community. as they pass by a Catholic church. In my experience, I've walked along an Orange Order parade and I've seen them stop in Belfast in front of a Catholic church. I mean, it's Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, so there's probably just the priest and a couple other people in there. But nonetheless, they stop there and they play contentious songs like the famine song, "The famine's over, why don't you go home?" I mean, if you play that in front of a Catholic cathedral, especially in somewhere like Scotland, it sends a certain message. Blood and Thunder bands and the Orange Order, they had different philosophies when it came to engaging in the Loyalist cause, in the Troubles, in the war in Northern Ireland. But they were united by their common devotion to preserving the legacy of Williamite loyalism. Blood and Thunder bands place heavy emphasis on percussion. While on parade, Blood and Thunder bands usually feature columns of up to 20 side snare drummers who tapped out an ongoing barrage of machine gun sounding rattles, a single large bass drum, usually the deep booms which filled the immediate sonic environment, supported by these side snare drummers. Further columns of up to 30 or so flautists, whose musical weapon of choice, the B-flat melody flute, followed these percussion sections. The B-flat melody flute produced this note, as you've heard, this notably shrill, high-pitched sound. Like the Billy bands that preceded the Blood and Thunder bands, the Blood and Thunder bands had a reputation for being raucous, for being disorderly, especially while on parade. They favored, instead of playing religious songs, you know, the Orange Order would like them to play Amazing Grace and How Sweet Thou Art, and right, Rock of Ages, you know, the standards. They like to play sectarian songs that you might hear at a football match rather than a church service. They wanted to provoke confrontation with Irish Catholics. Blood and Thunder band music was comprised almost exclusively of secular party songs, played extremely loud, played at an extremely fast tempo. In Blood and Thunder bands, there was no room for improvisation. Like all of the military-inspired bands since William of Nassau first instituted this practice, the Blood and Thunder musicians were forced to rigidly play to the heavy beat of the bass drum. And this, in turn, invoked a sense of driven purpose, unity within the collective. Quasi-militant and intensely devout Blood and Thunder bands rapidly gained popularity as we moved through the 1970s and into the 1980s. You know, they were outlets, they were enclaves for young working class men and boys that were searching for new ways to express their loyalism outside of the very rigid Orange Order, the very churchy Orange Order, right? The Orange Order was for their dads and for their granddads. They wanted something a little bit more raw, something a little bit more culturally appropriate. For these young working class males in Northern Ireland and Scotland, being a British loyalist, being a Protestant, was an expression of their cultural and political identity. By the end of the 1970s, many young loyalists considered the Orange Order's stance on the conflict in Northern Ireland to be too passive. Blood and Thunder bands offered an alternative cultural vessel for loyalists that were unaffiliated with the Orange Order. They could still participate in these annual rituals. By participating in orange parades, loyalist bands affirmed their support for the general unionist position without necessarily confirming their support of the Orange Order. Thus, by the final 2 decades of the 20th century, Orange Order ritual celebrations were really the property, not of the Orange Order anymore, as they had been since 1796, but this wider loyalist community. You could participate in these parades, in these rituals, in these ceremonies, without being part of this secret society, this fraternal organization that's kind of like the Masons, right? The rough nature of Blood and Thunder bands was reflected in the physical environment from which many of them emerged. I mean, these were working class people. These are people that after World War II, a lot of them live in what we call housing estates. Here in America, they're basically subsidized housing. The ghettoization of the urban working class residential life that persisted in Northern Ireland and Scotland after the end of World War II, it resulted in limited social, recreational, housing, and employment opportunities for young working class Scottish and Northern Irish males. So the Blood and Thunder bands were the Loyalist community's answer to some of these social ills. Weekly band practices served as a regular affirmation of their culture. Bands provided young working class males, I mean, you know, it's kind of like an after school program with something to do. You have to go to practice. You have to learn how to play the flute. There becomes that, once again, just like the original military folks back in the 1600s, right? It creates obedience. It creates discipline. All members felt, at least at some level, obliged to participate because of their ethnic, their ideological identification with Ulster loyalism. For many, membership in the local Loyalist band, it was a family tradition. My dad did it, my granddad did it, and so I'm going to do it as well. There was also something called the Rangers effect. So, as another vestige of this Loyalist identity outside of the bands, football culture, so soccer, right? There's a soccer team in Glasgow called the Glasgow Rangers. The Glasgow Rangers are the team of monarchy, the team of loyalism. If you go to a Glasgow Rangers football match, you see British flags everywhere, Northern Irish flags, orange and blue, you know, the colors of loyalism. I did a tour of their locker room and the stadium and everything. They have two pictures of the Queen, right, in the locker room, one above the lockers and one that they kind of touch, you know, Notre Dame style that's a pretty bad comparison, Notre Dame and the Catholic Irish. But Notre Dame style is, you know, they kind of walk out the door onto the pitch. The antithesis, the opposite, the foe of Glasgow Rangers is another Glasgow team called Glasgow Celtic that is made up of Roman Catholic, mainly support. Was founded by a Roman Catholic priest, by Roman Catholic immigrants that were escaping the potato famine back in the 1870s and 1880s. Interesting, huh? Pretty cool stuff. There's a lot of little vestiges of this symbolic loyalism. So a lot of them, when they go to these Rangers games, they hear all of the chants, the songs that they play at the Orange Order parades. So how can you be in it without having to, you know, be all churchy and give up, you know, going out and drinking and all that kind of the violence associated with it? How do you get involved in loyalism? You can be a member of a band. You can be a member of the band. The Blood and Thunder bands on occasion are often cited as lacking musical ability. And considered by a lot of observers, probably y'all that just especially watch the Lambeg drums here, be a little bit more than a loose collection of socially delinquent boys, you know, basically making sectarian noise. Believe me, it is deeper than that. This perception of Blood and Thunder bands, the Blood and Thunder phenomena, comes from a lack of understanding about this section of the wider Loyalist band tradition. The emergence of these Blood and Thunder bands in the working class communities of Northern Ireland, this was the 1970s. This is when they emerge. So I think about the music that would have been popular with working class people in Belfast, working class people in Scotland in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s. It would have been metal, you know, heavy metal, emanating out of places like Birmingham, you know, so like Black Sabbath, right? Bands that are emanating out of London like Iron Maiden, and bands emanating right out of punk bands. The huge punk rock scene in Belfast. There's a renowned band called the Outcasts. Not Outcasts, but the Outcasts that were, check them out, a phenomenal punk band. So these Blood and Thunder bands, they're listening to this more rigid, this more heavy music. If you go to an Iron Maiden concert, if you go to a Sex Pistols concert, what are they doing? They're giving the proverbial, V sign. This is basically flipping you off is what I'm doing here in Britain, right? They're giving the proverbial V sign to society, aren't they? That's what punk does. That's what the Sex Pistols did, right? That's what Black Sabbath does. That's what the Outcasts did. And also, when you went to one of those concerts, when you saw them on TV, do they just stand up there like the Grateful Dead and play their songs like this, and adios, we're done? Is that how they do it? Or they get up there and they bang their head and they freaking rock their guitars like Judas Priest, right? And so we start to see that translate into these band parades. Instead of just, marching like this, now you're starting to see, especially the bass drummers, which are usually large tattooed men, doing these bodily gesticulations, banging their head, right? The Catholics called it a loyalist swagger, just another way to provoke the Catholic community. So together with the heavy metal-esque party songs, the crude, cocky gestures, the tattoos, right, which become very popular in the 70s and 80s. The tattoos are going to be William, the Red Hand of Ulster, the British flags, bulldogs, Rangers, football club stuff. Things that if you're in the community and you have this on, it means you're okay. You're in the family, right? Identity markers. Contemporary Loyalist Blood and Thunder bands in Northern Ireland and Scotland are the legacy of a long history of sustained Orange Loyalist ritual practice that placed heavy emphasis on military-style music as a primary agent of cultural diffusion. They are part of the Ulster-oriented lived musical folk tradition, charged with sonically conveying the triumphs and the tragedies of the Loyalist story annually at the ritual events. Using established Orange Order rituals, Loyalist flute bands were able to influence the Loyalist narrative. They don't have to be part of the Orange Order. Through their songs, through their style, through their uniforms, through their symbols. The fact that so many young working class Loyalists in Scotland, Northern Ireland turned away from the Orange Order and to these bands as their primary mode of expressing their Loyalist identity, it illustrates, to me at least, a steady decline in the power of this old Orange Order institution. When you look at any of the footage, like the one I showed you, those people with the collarettes, they're all graying like me, aren't they? They're all older. The young people are in the bands. The growing number of these independent parades away from the Orange Order, without Orange Order marchers, that are held, apart from the Orange Order ritual events, demonstrates that popular interest in the custom of ritually parading to fife and drum music, flute and drum music, it remains. But 2 decades into the 21st century, the position of these Blood and Thunder bands as a primary culture, a vessel of culture, as cultural arbiters of popular loyalism in the southwestern lowlands of Scotland and in Northern Ireland, undoubtedly remains intact. Questions about anything? I mean, that's pretty loaded, isn't it? I tried to keep it short because those of you that have me in class know that I can be long-winded, so I can talk about this for another 3 hours if you'd like. Any questions about anything? Had any of you ever heard about any of this before? Have any of you heard of Northern Ireland before? Those of you that have taken my map test, you know the difference between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Those of you that are in my world history class are learning a little bit about the difference between Ireland and Northern Ireland and the history thereof. But like I say, the conflict in Northern Ireland, the culture that I'm talking about revolves around, it was the longest conflict that Europe has seen in quite some time. It was a 30-year-long conflict that by the time of my first visit to Northern Ireland, it hadn't fizzled out yet. And so there were still checkpoints and the British Army was still deployed on the streets. It was a real war. Now, on these marches, even still today, there is still discontent. Oftentimes, Catholics will attack these marches. One of the marches I went to was attacked, it scared me to death, was attacked with fireworks, I thought they were guns, and golf balls. They were up on roofs hitting golf balls at the paraders, right? Any questions about anything? Yes, yes, sir. Yeah, so in places like New York and Boston, you don't have a lot of orange water because the people that migrated there were mainly Irish Catholics escaping the famine. So if you were to go into South Boston and wear your Rangers shirt or your orange collar red, I think you might get shot. And the reason being, you might get roughed up because a lot of terrorists, IRA terrorists, escaped to places like Boston and Chicago and New York, and it's since laid low. Even though there was amnesty given after the Good Friday Agreement, some of them are still there, some rough folks that don't like Protestants. Yeah. Do we see that here, though, in North America, like Orange Order celebrations or marches or anything? We do. The main place would be in Ontario, where you have a population, a small, but a population of Ulster Scots, as we call them, right? Northern Ireland Protestants, Ulster Scots, not Scotch Irish. That's not a thing. Scotch is a drink. Ireland are a people. You can't have a Scotch person. You can have a Scot, right? Any other questions? A good question. So most of the Americans, they identify with, rightly or wrongly, with the Irish Catholic population, with the IRA, with republicanism, with Irish nationalism, mainly up in the Northeast. As you go down south into Tennessee and into Pennsylvania and down into the Carolinas, those are Northern Ireland Protestants. The hillbillies, the Billy part of hillbilly, the hillbilly, y'all have heard that term hillbilly before. You heard me talk about Billy bands and William III. So the reason that people like me, Appalachian Americans, are called hillbillies is because people up in the mountains, and a lot of those immigrants to the United States in the late 1700s, they would have pictures of William. They were part of this Williamite tradition. They would sing the songs, right? A lot of our bluegrass music comes from the culture of this, right? Bluegrass music isn't Irish or anything like that. It's mainly Ulster Scots and English. You learned something new today. You can win at Jeopardy. Go ahead. Yeah, so they come here. The Protestants come here mainly because there is a downturn in the linen industry. A lot of working class Protestants, especially in places like Belfast, worked in the linen industry. So they come here most of them during or just after the American Revolution. And there's land here. You know, there's promise here, especially down in Appalachia. You know, Appalachia, just after the American Revolution, is really being opened up. Also, a lot of these Ulster Scots fight for George Washington in the American Revolution. I believe it is George Washington that says he never could have won the revolution had it not been for the Ulster Scots. I mean, they're pretty militant, hardcore people, so it stands to reason. We don't see our influx of Irish Catholics really until the middle part of the century, mainly those that are lucky enough to flee the famine and come to New York City and Chicago and come out here to the West, right? A lot of our homesteaders, after fighting in the Civil War for the United States, they come out here and they start homesteads and they come out here and work on the railroads, on the mines, and a lot of you are their descendants, I would assume. Other questions? I think it's a good question. I love talking about Ireland. I can do this all day. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you see any of these bands form up in the South?
Like in the deep, deep South where I'm from? Or in the south of Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland? So down in the South, the opposite of the Orange Order is the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And the Ancient Order of Hibernians, they kind of copy the Protestant tradition. They do have fife and flute bands and drums. They're usually not as disciplined and organized and large, it seems, as the Protestant ones. And it seems that also during the 19th century that the Ancient Order of Hibernians also employed the use of the lambeg drum as well. There are, in the primary sources, it suggests that, especially in some of the more rural areas where people didn't totally hate each other because because of who they were, you know, Protestant, Catholic stuff. It sounds like that Protestants would actually loan either musicians with the drums or the drums themselves to the ancient order of Hibernians for their little celebration. Isn't that the way it should be? You know, I don't have to like your ways, but do your thing. I'll loan you some instruments. I'm going to go on vacation. Off you go, right? Good question. Anything else? Did you learn anything? Fantastic. If you have any questions after, if you want to ask me in private, I'll hang around for a little bit, but I appreciate you coming. And that's all I've got for you. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.